happens to it. So this is a simple example of a PDE. Now, if we come to fluid dynamics, then a popular model is the incompressible Navier-Stokes equations. So now we actually deal with several different coupled partial differential equations. So here we just had one partial differential equation in several spatial dimensions. Here we have essentially 4 different partial differential equations in 3 spatial dimensions. So the first momentum equation is actually 3 equations, and then the mass conservation equation, which here is the divergence-free condition, is 1 equation. So this is a very popular model in fluid dynamics in various applications. Again, this is not limited to fluid dynamics, as I mentioned. So structural mechanics is also governed by partial differential equations, typically. Maxwell's equations of electrodynamics, electromagnetics are also partial differential equations. Schrodinger's equation of quantum mechanics, and the Black-Scholes equations for option pricing, many of these are partial differential equations. Just a second. Yeah, okay. So moving on. Also, along with the partial differential equation, we need some initial condition, which is at all points in space, we would need an initial condition at the 0th time. And we would also need boundary conditions. So in general, it is some function of u, and it is some equation given on the boundary of the domain. So we would need boundary conditions as well. So for example, for the convection diffusion reaction equation, a typical boundary condition is, we just say that the concentration of the species, say, is 0 at the boundaries. So that could be a simple boundary condition. And these initial and boundary conditions are needed for a well-posed problem that we can solve. So solving PDEs. So in general, it is quite different, and so that's these unknown variables here and the v here, as well as the 2 infinite dimensional function spaces. So that essentially means that you would need an infinite amount of memory and computations to actually compute an exact solution. So we give up on computing exact solutions, and we discretize the equations and reduce them to finite dimensional unknowns, and then we obtain approximate solutions. So at this point, I would pause for a minute and see if anyone has any questions. So I could, if write in the chat if there are any questions. Point, and then I'll move on, and I'll stop at the end of the next. Okay, so I think I'll move on for now. So discretization. Now, because we need to discretize the equations, because we can't exactly solve the original equation, the first steps is to, yes, okay, I see a question here. Amandeep Kaur asked, why is it infinite dimensions? Yes, that is a good question. So let me go back to, so any, so a function like this can be any function. For instance, it can be exponential, it can be logarithmic, it can be anything. And if you compare that to, say, a second degree or a first degree polynomial, so if you have a linear function, then you would only need 2 parameters to describe that function, right? Just the y-intercept and the slope. So a linear function actually belongs to a 2-dimensional function space. But if you want to consider all possible functions, not just polynomials, including logarithmic and sinusoidal or any such functions, then in general, you would need an infinite dimensional function. Continuous function. So that's why it's infinite dimension to be in kind of to be rough about it essentially, and we want to reduce it to some finite dimensional problem. So that is what I meant. Okay, so that we want to simulate on. One of the first steps is to get an unstructured mesh we want, and the computer stores, we need to make the computer store the information about their connectivity. It will work to generate usually, but they are less efficient on the hardware because we need to store more details about the mesh. Now, I'll be focusing on one discretization method, which is the finite volume method, primarily because there are many methods and it would take too much time to go through all of them. And this is a particularly simple method in its most basic form. So it has three main ingredients and two of them are from vector calculus. So one is the divergence theorem, which most of you would probably have seen. So it relates the volume integral of a divergence with of some vector field. The Green-Gauss theorem, which is related but not quite the same. Both of these can be derived from Green's theorems, which come from essentially, we have this concept of a Riemann problem. A Riemann problem is simply, suppose the script L describes some differential equation, some partial differential equation. So we want to solve this differential equation with respect to this initial condition, where for some part of the domain, it has some constant value, and for some other part of the domain, it has some other constant value. I'll come to more details about this pretty soon. So finite volume methods at their most fundamental level are just based on these. If we take a simple example of the convective field of velocity A, which convex, whose concentration is given by U. So using the divergence theorem, we can write this in an integral form. And in this case, we integrate it on every mesh cell, which I denote here by Ki. And the mesh is denoted by TH. And H here is a that describes the size of the smallest cell in the mesh. And this will be important later. Divergence theorem. And we need a value on on each boundary. And on the boundary, there's no unique value what this thing is on the boundary. So to do that, we use this concept of a Riemann problem. And in the most simple case, because this is a scalar problem with a linear term, we can actually define the flux as we pick up the flux from the right cell if the convective velocity is opposite to the normal. So if the flow is going from right to left, which is opposite to the normal, we pick the value in the right cell. So this is called an upwind numerical flux. And why this makes sense is because since the flow is going from right to left, it is the upstream information which would affect the downstream regions. So it makes sense to pick the upstream data for the discretization. And similarly, if the flow is actually from left to right, then we use the data from the left cell. And that is how we resolve what value to use for this integral here. And that is why the Riemann problem is important. Yeah, so this is the most simple case, but in this can get pretty complicated pretty soon, depending on how complicated the PDE actually is. So for the sake of brevity, I won't go through the viscous, how the viscous term is discretized, but it needs the Green's theorem, but it follows a similar path. Now, so finally, once we do all that, we can arrive at a discretized problem. So we apply that process to every cell in the mesh. And when we do that, the U values, the UIs at each cell is coupled with at least its neighbors, essentially, because the flux at some phase would depend on the unknowns at the two cells that contain that phase. Because depending on the upwind numerical flux, we would pick up the value from either this cell or this cell. So the dependence is on the neighbors in this case, in the most simple case. So once we write out this discretized equation, this L of U equals 0 for the cell I, we would have an equation that couples the unknowns on these 4 cells in this case. So we denote the discretized residual once we apply the numerical flux and everything. We denote the discretized equation as LH because we discretized it on a mesh described by H. Approximate problem that we want to solve is given by LH of UH is 0, which is related to the original problem LU equals 0 by the fact that we discretized it. An n-dimensional problem if we have n cells in this case. So if there are n cells, we have one variable for each cell, which describes the constant value of the variable on that cell. And then we have equations that couple all of those variables. So this LHUH is also written as R for future reference, and this is called the residual. So ultimately, at the solution point, we would want that L of U is 0. Whereas if we plug in any other solution, then L of U would not be 0, and the R would not be 0. And in that case, we say that there is a residual, which is not 0. And the objective is to drive the residual to 0, essentially. So, so for discretizations, one of the most important things is to have a discretization that makes sense, in that it gives an approximation that is useful. And the way to quantify that is to have a discretization that is consistent and stable. So what we mean by consistency is that the original PDE denoted here by L and the discretized equations denoted by LH, the difference between them, and this is a norm symbol, so the difference between them in some norm tends to 0 as H tends to 0. And what H tends to 0 means is that we are refining the mesh. So if you remember, I said that H is a parameter that describes the smallest cell size in a given mesh. So as we refine the mesh, the H tends to 0. And what we need is that this difference should also go to 0. I know that if we want some more accuracy, we can just refine the mesh and we can get more accuracy. In that sense, it is a discretization that makes sense. And we also want the numerical method to be stable. And what this means, the solution remains bounded with respect to some initial condition that we start with. So it should be bounded for all times. So this mostly makes sense for a time-dependent problem, but typically for iterative methods, even for steady-state problems, such an equivalent condition does come into play. So yeah, essentially we want the approximate solution to remain bounded and not low. Yeah. So finally, the actual equations that I work with are these equations. So these are the steady compressible Navier-Stokes equations. So what I showed you earlier were the incompressible Navier-Stokes equations. These are the compressible Navier-Stokes equations. And in this case, the 3 momentum components, and we have the total energy. And now the convective flux is actually more complicated because we have the convective fluxes for the mass convection, the momentum and pressure, as well as the energy. And finally, the viscous terms are given by a stress tensor, which depends on a strain tensor, which depends on the velocity. So I've left out most of the details here. Fluxes are given by this expression. And again, even the energy has a viscous component. Yeah, so you might observe that this is a nonlinear problem, as were the incompressible equations. This, we get a system of nonlinear equations. Yeah. Okay, so if there are any questions, so there is a question: if we opt for a fine graded mesh, the computational complexity is more. How to optimize that case? Yes, I will come to that. The upwind method is this method. Good question. So there are, even for hyperbolic PDEs, there are several ways to do this. Upwind is just one of them. We can use a central difference with artificial dissipation. So it happens that for hyperbolic problems, a pure central difference tends to be unstable. So we need to add artificial dissipation for to stabilize it. And people use both are good. So to tell whether one is better than the other. And also, yes, if you don't have a hyperbolic equation, I did not go through that part. If you have more of an elliptic problem, or even just for the discretization of the viscous part in the convection diffusion equation, then it's not exactly upwind. We use a central flux plus a correction term. Again, it's kind of similar to the artificial dissipation. But those can be found in some of the references that I have in the slides, and I guess they will be shared at some point. If you could please say the significance of the continuity equation. Yes. So the continuity equation basically just says that we want the mass to be conserved. So it is simply a conservation of mass, conservation of momentum, and the third is a conservation of energy. So they are simply mass, momentum, and energy conservation equations. What is the norm you are considering for the measurement of stability and consistency? Yes, that is a great question. So that this is largely dependent on the problem and what we are trying to do. So the infinity and the L2 norms are quite commonly used. If we can do the analysis in the L infinity norm, then essentially that's the max norm. So that's quite a strong statement. Whereas the L2 norm has some nice properties. So typically it's either the L infinity or the L2 norms. But there's no hard and fast rule for selecting it. It depends really on the purpose. So whether FVM depends on the class of FD methods, you could find an equivalence between the finite volume and finite difference methods for certain cases. But in general, the finite volume methods are not equivalent to finite difference methods. And I don't know if it's accurate to say that it depends on it. They are related, but they are also different. Can one use upwind for parabolic PDEs? Yes, that is actually a good question. A simple answer might have been no, but actually the people have been trying to use upwind for parabolic and elliptic PDEs as well. That is a research topic. So actually yes, but whether you want to do that is a good question. You might want to use a different method for this. Oh, the deficiency result, I will go to it. And yeah, okay. So I'll proceed to the next section now. I'll now talk about the solvers that we use and what are the considerations for how to solve these discretized equations. So in CFD problems and in many other problems in computational electromagnetics or say financial Black-Scholes equations, in many cases we want to solve large problems. Especially in CFD, in aerodynamics, if we want to simulate an entire aircraft, for example, we may want up to 100 million degrees of freedom, where degrees of freedom is one variable in the grid. That's 1 degree of freedom. So yeah, for industrial cases, we typically want tens or even hundreds of millions of variables. And especially for CFD, the matrices that arise, and in general, the equations that arise are non-symmetric. So that is also a challenge, because there are many methods available for symmetric problems which are efficient, but which don't work for non-symmetric problems. And there are many features of the solution that to capture them, we might have to introduce features in the mesh, which might actually make the problem more difficult to solve. That does happen sometimes. And one simple example, which is sometimes an issue, is these kind of very high aspect ratio cells in the what are called the boundary layers. So for high-speed flows, the the viscous effects are limited to a thin portion of the domain, which is the boundary layer, which is close to the wall of some solid. So if this aspect ratio is not perfectly matched to the flow, then it leads to ill conditioning, and we need good methods to solve the problem then. So essentially we require nonlinear and linear solvers which are effective. And one of the key points that I want to emphasize is that more and more variables are required to resolve increasingly complex flow features. So for instance, decades ago, the state of practice in CFD was just to solve the inviscid flow equations and to ignore initially the effect of viscous forces, and then kind of add them later at a different stage, and then go back to the inviscid simulation and so on. So one CFD simulation would typically just deal with inviscid problems. So at some point, people realized that they can actually add the viscous effects and simulate the whole thing at once, and decrease the time to solution. And then when they did that, the number of variables that was needed went up drastically. So for instance, all these high aspect ratio elements are just to capture the viscous effects. So if we did not care about viscous effects, the cells would look more like this near the outside. So we would have much less degrees of freedom, much less variables. So the point is that as we want to resolve increasingly complex flow features, we need larger problems. And also increasingly complex geometries. So for example, in an aircraft, the cruising aircraft is much simpler. Example, the high lift devices are more complex to simulate. So again, the high lift devices need a lot more variables typically than the aircraft simulation in a cruise flight. So scalable solvers are needed. We need the algorithms to scale to larger and larger problems. We don't want to stop just because we hit a bottleneck we're just waiting forever for the simulation to complete. Okay, so as I said earlier, the discretized system of equations I'm going to write in this way, where R function for every cell in the grid, and W is a vector variable where there is one unknown for every cell in the grid. And that is for a scalar problem. For the compressible Navier-Stokes equations, we have at least 5 unknowns for every cell in the grid and 5 equations for every cell in the grid. So typically this is a system of nonlinear equations. So how would we solve this? One simple, not well, one immediate thing that comes to mind is Newton-Raphson. So if we want a system to compute the Jacobian matrix, and at every step of Newton-Raphson, we solve this linear system, and then so we can just simulate this for a long time until the solution stops changing. Once we write it in this way, we can actually use ODE solvers, ordinary differential equation solvers, to solve this. So one simple example is forward Euler. We can just do a first order approximation in time, just do a forward Euler, and we can have this explicit equation where at pseudo time level n, if we have the solution, we can compute the solution at the next pseudo time level. And then we turn the crank and keep updating this until the Wn is basically no different from Wn plus 1, at which point we stop and say that it's converged. So the advanced method, the forward Euler, is it's simple to program, and it's what is called sometimes as embarrassingly parallel. Essentially, this V is a block diagonal matrix. So inverting this is no, it's not a complex task. It's pretty easy, and there's no coupling. It's block diagonal. Every cell can be dealt with independently, and and we just implement this, which is pretty simple. But the disadvantage of this method is that there's a restrictive stability, but typically inversely dependent, say, cells that we have in the grid is tiny. Is inversely would have a cost of O and operations and the number of to converge this problem. So O and squared is pretty bad. So if we want to solve a problem that's twice as big, we would need to spend 4 times the resources, which is pretty bad. So we want to do something better. The other option is we could use an implicit ODE solver, say backward Euler. So if we use backward Euler, then we get this discretized equation. And to solve, and because it's implicit, again, we need a linearization of the residual, which once we do that, we get this. So if you know, this is very similar to the Newton discretization. This was the Newton algorithm, I guess, the equation that we solve for Newton method. And this is for the backward Euler method. So they are very similar, but we just add the fictitious time term. And essentially what time step, then this gives the solver initial gets to start this city limit. We can let steps have been taken. And as the time step tends to infinity, this term goes to 0, and we can recover quadratic convergence given by Newton. And if it converges quadratically, then in a very few number of steps, this will converge to say machine precision. So, but the problem here now is we need to solve this linear system of equations. And this is a large sparse linear system, which is non-symmetric. And this is the right-hand side. And this is the whole matrix that needs to be solved. So how do we solve the sparse linear system? Now, for solving linear systems, we have several options. So either we can use a sparse direct solver, which by direct solver, I mean something like Gaussian elimination or Cholesky factorization if it's symmetric. In this case, it's not symmetric, so it's essentially some variant of Gaussian elimination. But typically, these are too expensive. They are robust. You will always get a if there exists one, but they are too expensive for us. So those we can use simple iterative methods like Jacobi iterations, and they also have an O(n) square cost. So again, this is no better than just using an explicit scheme. So this is not good. Gauss-Seidel, again, Gauss-Seidel and incomplete LU factorization. These can be cost effective in the sense that each iteration is cheap, but again, they need a lot of iterations to converge, because of which, again, their cost is O(n) squared. Now we can use what are called preconditioned Krylov subspace methods. So this is it will take a lot of time to go through the Krylov subspace methods, but essentially what I will say is they try to find a solution by solving an optimization problem in some subspace of the entire n-dimensional space that we want to solve it. So it computes optimal approximations step by step in larger and larger subspaces. So because of that, it can be quite effective. And typically it needs preconditioning to work well. And the preconditioner can be any of the aforementioned methods. It can be Gauss-Seidel, it can be LU factorization. So preconditioned Krylov subspace methods can be quite effective. But again, they are not exactly scalable typically. So they would have some superlinear cost. Yeah. And we want a scalable solver. So by scalable, what I mean for the purpose of CFD, so that's the optimal, the best case. Now, is that even possible? If many people would say that that's impractical, but it actually is possible in some cases, and I will now come to that. So typically we need multi-level methods to start approaching an optimal solver, which just has an O(n) cost. Now, one of multi-level solvers are multi-grid methods. And this is, multi-grid methods are a class of solvers that use a hierarchy of grids, which are coarser and coarser than the original grid that we want to solve the problem on. So an example here is, if the original grid was all the lines here, then the coarse grid, so the black circles here could be the points in a coarse grid, and that's sometimes called regular coarsening in 2 dimensions. The other idea that's needed for multigrid is the simple observation. Well, it's not that simple, I guess, but it's pretty simple to observe. Um, is that the simple iterative methods like Gauss-Seidel and Jacobi and excess advanced chapter methods, they, even though they are very effective, so if I have some approximate solution, then it implies that I have some error uh, 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 given by that solution on a certain grid. So if we can think of this grid, and this discrete signal in space has many frequency components. So it turns out, as well as, of course, a linear problem. So the whole idea is, we have, suppose, any grid level and capital L solution on the fine grid, and it could be all of zeros when we start off, because we know nothing better. So we need a smoothing iteration, which is denoted here by SH, and the smoothing iteration can be Jacobi, can be Gauss-Seidel, can even be forward Euler, it can be any kind of iterative method. And we apply this some number of iterations, a small number of iterations of this iterative method. And then we transfer the residual and the approximate solution that we have after smoothing. And the I here denote different intergrid transfer operators. So if once we have the residual, we can apply a grid transfer operator, and we can compute an approximate residual on the coarser level. And similarly for the solution itself, the approximate solution, compute a residual on the coarser level. So just as we discretize the original PDE on the fine grid, we can do the same on the coarse grid. And if once we discretize the PDE on the coarse grid, we have a residual on the coarse grid as well. So they both approximate the same PDE, but their accuracies and some characteristics are different because they are on different grids. So once we have this is called a forcing function, and once we have the forcing function on the coarse level, we can then solve almost the same problem on the fine grid, which was this problem. This was our original problem that we wanted to solve, the nonlinear problem. And something very similar to that, but just discretized on a different grid level, needs to be solved on a coarse grid problem, except that there is a forcing function. And typically this is just constant for this solve. And then suppose we can solve this somehow, then we can now prolongate or interpolate the approximate solution back to the fine grid. Actually, error, and prolongate the error which to the fine grid. And this is not, of course, not the exact error. This is just the error between the solution computed after solving this to what we had initially before solving it. And then we interpolate this to the fine level. And once we have the fine level, we typically smooth again, post-smooth, and apply a few more iterations of the post-smoothing. Now, typically, we recursively solve this with multigrid. So this equation, because this is so similar to the original equation, we apply a multigrid again to this, and we further have a coarser level to solve this problem. And we keep going coarser and coarser levels until we have a very trivial equation with, say, only a few hundred unknowns. And that problem we can solve. And then again, we, all the way back up to get to the finest level that we want. And one such is called a, as usual, something this magical has caveats. Now we need several, I'll come to some of the caveats, I guess. So we need several components as would be evident from the previous slide. So we need to generate a coarser level, firstly. So if we have a structured grid, it's and we need grid transfer operators. So once we have the coarse level, we need to devise good grid transfer operators such that the residuals and the unknowns can be restricted and interpolated between the grids. We need a cycling strategy. So the one that I described was a V cycle. So in the sense, we start at the finest level and we go down to the coarsest level. Typically, we have many levels, grid levels, and then we come back up all the way. But that's not the only way to do it. There are many different kinds of cycles. We need a good coarse grid solver. So once we get to the coarsest level, we need to be able to solve the problem on that coarse grid. And it may not necessarily be obvious how we are going to do that. So that's also a component that needs to be developed. And finally, we need the smoothing operator, because that's kind of the main thing that's doing all the work, which is damping the discrete high frequencies on every grid level. And that's how we attack every single error component. The different grid levels will be attacking different error components and damping them. Because we only need to approximately solve that smoothing problem, we just need a few iterations of say a highly inexact Newton. We don't actually need to solve the whole Newton problem, for instance. We can just use a backward Euler, for example, and to solve the backward Euler, just a few iterations of Gauss-Seidel iterations, for example, can be done for smoothing. The whole point is that the smoothing operation is an ON operation, in that it only needs a constant times n, because it only does a few iterations of some simple iterative method. Now, the Runge-Kutta iterations are, again, as I said, embarrassingly parallel, but they are slow because they have that stability limit, and they may not be that fast in damping the high frequency errors. The Newton-like smoothers, like backward Euler, they are better at this. But again, we need some efficient linear iterations that are also parallel, because we want to solve these on parallel computers. So the implicit smoothing iterations may not necessarily be parallel. And that's what I'll be coming to next. Maybe I should stop at this point as well to see if there are some questions. Yeah, I'll just take a look if there are any questions at this point. Okay, let's see. So how better is finite element method when compared to finite volume method in steady state equations? That is actually a complex topic. That is a good question. And it really depends. So if we talk about fluid dynamics and steady state, again, even in fluid dynamics, it depends on a lot of things. And even there are many different kinds of finite element methods. So it really depends on what kind of finite element method we are talking about. And for example, there are discontinuous Galerkin methods, which are quite suitable for compressible flow problems, but they are more complex to develop. they have more issues to develop. And whereas the continuous finite element methods, which are more typical, they may not work as well for compressible flow problems, though again, they have also been used. So it's quite a rich field, and there's no short answer to this. To solve the system equations RW, is there any better numerical method to solve than Newton-Raphson? Yes, so I just went through that. So one of the best methods is actually the nonlinear multigrid method, which is what I described, which is called the full approximation storage multigrid, which is not exactly a Newton method, though there are some relationships, but the FAS method is an alternate that can be used. And there are many other methods as well. There are nonlinear versions of Gauss-Seidel and Jacobi that you can use the explicit methods as well, like forward Euler, and have a fictitious time. So there are many methods to do that. For the smoothing, what is the order of RK? Yes, that is a good question. It actually depends on your specific problem. For example, for compressible flows, people who want to use RK, they typically use 4-stage or 5-stage RK methods, but they are typically not your traditional RK 4-5, for example. The coefficients are not optimized for accuracy, because ultimately we are solving a steady state problem. We don't need the time stepping to be accurate. What the coefficients are optimized for are damping the high frequency errors. So there are special RK methods of multiple stages that are used for smoothing. Can any of the finite element methods be used to solve the nonlinear equations here? Technically, yes. Any finite element method can be used, but again, they have their strengths and weaknesses, and some are more difficult to develop and adapt than others. How to define grid tests on difficult structures like Strom, I don't know what that is, tsunami. Define grid tests. So I imagine you're talking about developing the computational grids. Yes, actually, that's a very domain specific problem. In fluid dynamics, in aerospace, for example, there are many considerations. For example, we want to capture the boundary layer. So there are these very high aspect ratio cells in the boundary layer. So that is one thing. And then for unsteady problems, there is vortex shedding. So we want to be able to capture the shed vortices, and the mesh has to be good enough for that. So there are many different considerations. So I cannot really give a good answer to that. Can Gaussian quadrature rule be implemented here? Yes, definitely. I'm assuming you're talking about the either the time stepping scheme or the integrals that are used for the finite volume schemes. So I talked about the most simple finite volume scheme. So a simple midpoint method works for that. But for more accurate finite volume schemes, yes, typically we use Gaussian quadratures to compute those integrals. I'm not aware of the hypermesh software, but you can use any meshing tool. Some of them, I mean, yes, some of them are better than others, but yes, you can use any tool typically. How do we identify which method we use? Yeah, that is very domain specific. Even in a single domain, there can be many options. So it most of the time it comes down to who are the people you know that you have access to. What is the expertise in your group? It typically comes down to that more than a systematic way of deciding which method to use. Would you be able to use Crank-Nicolson? Yes, you could use Crank-Nicolson, but there is no point. Because we are trying to solve a steady state problem, we just need to damp the high frequency errors or to just converge the nonlinear problem. So because of that, we don't care about the accuracy in time. We just need to get to the steady state. We just care about the accuracy in space for these problems. If you do care about accuracy in time, then that's a whole different game, and we would be using either Crank-Nicolson or something even more accurate. Which software you use for solver? So for the solver, I typically either write my own solvers, or our research group, we write our own solvers, but yeah, you can use any solver. For meshing, there is an open source tool which I use called Gmesh. That can happen, or spend more time on getting a better mesh. So what is the most accurate method that you can use? Again, that's highly dependent on the specific problem type, and all of the methods can technically be made as accurate as you want, as long as they are consistent and stable. One basic question: how to define a problem is linear or nonlinear mathematically? Okay, so to define whether a problem is linear or nonlinear mathematically, what we mean is that whatever data we have, so in this case, the data is the geometry, the geometric parameters, it's the boundary conditions, it is the initial conditions. So the dependence of the final solution on these parameters is linear. That's what we mean by a linear problem in this case. So it is linear in the sense that the typical definition of a linear function, scalability and additivity. So if the final solution depends linearly on the given data, then we call it a linear problem. And the CFD problems are typically nonlinear. How do we choose an initial value for the parameter? Which parameter are we talking about here? I guess it would be the delta tau, I guess, the time step, or yeah, maybe you can make it more specific in a later session. Okay, so I'm going to move on for now. Hopefully I can come back to Aruna's question at some point. Yeah. So we now move to parallel scientific computing. So up to now, I talked about the efficiency of the linear and nonlinear solvers. The linear and nonlinear solvers. So now we need the parallel scaling. So I think I'm running out of time as well. So I think I'll speed up a bit. We not only need the problem to be the numerical scheme to be scalable in terms of the operations and memory transactions. We want it to be scalable in parallel as well, because for solving large problems, we need to solve it on parallel computers. So typically we care about strong scaling and weak scaling. What strong scaling means is that the solver can run increasingly faster as we use more and more parallel processors on a fixed problem size. So that's essentially only considers the parallel scalability of the algorithm. The weak scaling is more general. So what weak scaling does is it considers the ability of the solver to scale to larger problems as we use more parallel processors. So So in this case, for some, the ideal weak scaling is if we double the problem size and we double the number of processors, then the amount of time that we need is unaffected. So if we double both things, it should be solved in the same amount of time. And that is the ideal goal. That's the optimal. So ideal weak scaling, we would need something, we would need an algorithm that scales well with respect to the memory operations and arithmetic operations, but is also has ideal parallel scalability. So that this is a difficult thing to attain in general. So one of the traditional ways of parallel computing is cluster parallelism. So we have a network of many computers which is connected over a fast interconnect, and we solve a problem on that. So to do that, the typical way is domain decomposition. So we take the whole domain, the whole mesh, and we subdivide the mesh into parts. And each part of the mesh is given off to one of those interconnected CPUs, which are called nodes. And each of them kind of computes approximate solutions independently, and then their boundaries communicate with each other to update each other about their current approximate solution on at the boundaries. So typically we use ghost or halo cells in the mesh at those boundaries to do the communication. So we basically need some duplicated cells at the subdomain boundaries. So there are many methods to solve this. So there is what is called an approximate subdomain block Jacobi, which is essentially we don't do anything special. We just let each of the subdomains solve independently, and then at the end of their solve, we combine their solutions, and then we move to the next iteration. So the local solves don't care about what's going on in the other subdomains. So they just work independently. And then there are additive Schwarz methods, where there is some communication even in the local solves. And how they do that is some layer of cells near the boundaries are actually further duplicated. and the different processors redundantly compute solutions. And then using those redundant solutions, we can do something better than simple block Jacobi. So, but the problem here is that both of these are not parallel scalable, in that as we increase the number of processors, they will need more and more iterations to converge the problem. Whereas what we really want is, as we increase the number of processors, it should be a constant number of iterations. So we need a multi-grid method, and single grid methods don't work. However, these methods can be used for the global smoothing for inside a multi-grid method. So because every multi-grid level is spread across all these different processors, we need something like this for the global smoother. And locally on each node, we use a simpler smoother like Gauss-Seidel or something like that. And then further from that, each node or each node in that network of CPUs that cluster, each node can actually have further parallel processors inside. So this is a more traditional CPU with 8 cores, and we may have 2 such CPUs on a single node in that cluster. And then this is a GPU with thousands of small cores. And this is a now defunct Xeon Phi Knights Landing with up to 72 cores on a single node. So that's even more parallelism. Even within a subdomain now, we need a parallel solver. And that's what I've been working on for my research. So I don't think I have time to go through specific details, but I'll quickly go through some of these things. So one of the things is that solver needs to respect the physics. So for example, for fluid dynamics in 2D, we have 4 unknowns in every cell. So the Jacobian matrix that's needed for Newton, the dRdW, it kind of looks like this. So we have these small dense blocks of coupling inside every cell. So we'll have the density, the momentum, and the energy, which are coupled at a single point. And then that is coupled to the variables in a different cell. So we have this kind of a nice block structure, and these are called point blocks. Also, the ordering of the cells is important, and that ordering, so in this case, it's some random ordering, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, it's random. But typically the ordering of the cells is also important. And many times, if it's dictated by the physics, we can get a very efficient solver. So I think this is essentially some numerical tests that illustrated that, but I'll skip through this. They're essentially evidence that these things matter, the mesh ordering and the point blocking. And also the solvers should respect the hardware architecture. So it's not just the physics, but also the hardware architecture. So the typical way of, say, storing matrices for solving that Newton problem, for example, is called a compressed sparse row storage. And the schematic is here where for every cell, we actually store the coefficients of the matrix contiguously for its different neighbors. And then we move to the next cell and store the coefficients for its neighbors, and then to the next cell and so on. But the other alternative is we can store a particular coefficient of all the cells first, and then we can store a different coefficients of all the cells and so on. So these matter, even though it may not matter for the mathematical convergence, it matters for the efficiency on the hardware. So the time that each iteration takes. So essentially this kind of a layout is actually more suitable for graphics processing units, GPUs, and vector processors like the Xeon Phi Knights Landing and the newer Intel processors, which have wide vector units like AVX512. So people who are more interested on the hardware and the programming side would be interested in this. Yeah. So some examples in aerodynamics. So this is a wing. It's a simple wing test case, and it's a transonic flow. So we have a shock structure that forms here. And so this is transonic. And here I have some comparisons of different solvers, how they behave. So again, I don't really have time to go through this, but that's kind of evidence of what I've been saying. And this is a larger case where there's a wing and a body, and this is what I'd shown in the first slide. This is a more difficult case with more, I guess, slightly more complex geometry, and it has more flow features. And again, this is a transonic case with a shock that forms midway through the wing. And again, here I'm comparing the domain decomposition with a solver that I and my group developed, which is more suited to GPUs and multi-core processors. Again, I have some details about so there are some interesting things about what to do on GPUs, but again, I don't really have time to go through them right now. So in conclusion, PDEs can model a variety of phenomena that are important to science and engineering. Fluid dynamics typically is modeled by a system of nonlinear PDEs. The PDEs are discretized so that we can solve them on computers using one of several methods, but the main point is that the discretization must be consistent and stable. Scalable solution can be achieved by multi-level solvers, and one example is a multi-grid solver. And in the best case, they can have an ON complexity. Again, I don't want people to go ahead with the impression that it's always ON. There is typically a lot of work that goes into development of an ON's solver, but it is possible. And that's what scalable solvers drive towards. Multi-grid solvers require finely tuned interplay of components. So again, I couldn't illustrate this very well in the time, but that's one of the reasons why it's difficult to develop. The various components need to respect the physics, and they need to respect the hardware architecture. And finally, parallel solvers are required to tap the modern computer hardware for scalable solution of PDEs, because most of the hardware that's coming out now has stopped getting faster than clock speed. We are just getting more and more cores and processors and transistors in each device. So it is essential to use the best hardware that's available today, and we'll just be going in that direction. So scalable parallel solvers are required. And thank you very much for your time and attention. And if the organizers think there is some time, I can take some more questions, but that is all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for sharing your knowledge and enlightening the session with the topic computational fluid dynamics. Actually, for the research students of fluid dynamics, Aditya Kashi has given a lot of glimpse on many computational techniques, and he has covered a lot of topics such as finite volume method, discretized problem, CFD problems, compressible solvers for nonlinear and linear system of equations, and the multi-grid solver, parallel scientific computing, and many solutions can be solved by the numeric methods. That also he has mentioned. So if any of the participants has any queries to ask, any doubts, you can send a question through the chat box.
Okay.
So the resource person is ready to answer.
Okay, so I can see many questions.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for spending your time.
Thank you. Okay, let's see. How to handle the control variable. Sometimes we are forced to ignore some variable, but they are responsible. How to remove such error? I'm not entirely sure what that means. How to handle the control variable. So are you talking about control problems, like optimal control problems? Those are different ballgame altogether. Those require many other techniques which are essentially out of scope of this presentation. And I'm also not very knowledgeable in that, so I would not be the person to answer that. For continuity, we need indefinite number of points. In domain decomposition, how can ensure continuity? So domain decomposition doesn't necessarily impact the discretization. So you can use domain decomposition for either continuous or discretizations. It doesn't really matter, because we use domain decomposition typically to solve the linear problem inside the Newton loop. So once we converge the linear problem inside the Newton loop, it doesn't really matter how you converged it. Whereas if you use, say, a nonlinear multigrid method, for example, then we are not actually converging a Newton method. And then, yes, it could matter. But again, because we are converging the whole nonlinear problem to a steady state, it really just depends on the discretization, whether the final solution, how continuous the final solution is. So it does not really matter. We can develop it in a manner where this does not matter. Which is the best, array of structures or structure of arrays? So I did not mention this, but the left-hand side, the diagram was array of was array of structures, and the right-hand side was structure of arrays. So this really depends on the hardware that you are running on, was my point for that slide. So depending on what kind of hardware we are running on, it makes sense to choose between the two. So if we are running on traditional CPUs, then array of structures is fine. And structure of arrays would also work okay. It may not be bad necessarily, but array of structures may have some advantages for a traditional CPU. The structure of arrays layout is almost essential for GPUs and wide vector processors. So it depends on the hardware. Which tools use for plotting? Yes. So for the 3D plots, I typically use ParaView. So ParaView is a nice open source tool that has a lot of scripting capabilities. So it's very nice. So I typically use ParaView for the 2D and 3D plots, whereas for the 1D plots, I just use Python or TIGS. What kind of real data is used for simulation? Yeah, okay, that's a good question. So I did not touch upon turbulence modeling. So that is, turbulence modeling is a place where real data is very useful. So most of the turbulence models are relatively ad hoc, and they really depend a lot on experimental data to get good models. So that is especially one place. Also, there are other things. Even if we forget about turbulence modeling and we do a direct numerical simulation, even then, to get the inflow conditions, for example, we may need some other methods. So typically, CFD is highly dependent on experimental data. So yes, that is a very good point. And also for me, especially most importantly, for validation of my numerical methods, I need experimental data. So it's indispensable. So I want to know where it is applied multigrid. So my main point is you should be trying to apply multigrid to everything. It's easier said than done. There is a lot of development to happen, and it might turn out to be an entire PhD topic to develop multigrid for your problem. But if it is a problem where large problems need to be solved, and right now you don't even know how large of a problem you might want to solve, then multigrid is almost the only way to go. And there are many different kinds of multigrid methods. I just touched on a very brief part. It's a very rich field, and you might want to look into that. How to start research in fluid dynamics? That is a good question. Okay, honestly, for me, it was one of my undergrad professors. I had a very good undergraduate professor who really made me interested. But for other people, it's other things. If you're really interested in, say, re-entry of space capsules, then CFD is really important. So applications can motivate you to start fluid dynamics. And to start research, I guess the main thing is to maybe do a project with some professor first, and the professor might guide you into what research to do. Yes, I can share my presentation. Maybe perhaps we can figure out a way to get the presentation to everyone. The finite difference method, yeah, it would take some time, so I don't think I'll do that right now, but the finite difference method has its strengths and its weaknesses, and that is also used not in industry so much, but it's used in research quite a lot. And finite difference methods are also relatively simple to understand, so they can be picked up quite easily. Scalable solvers, yes. So can I please tell more about scalable solvers? So again, multigrid methods are pretty much pretty much the only kind of scalable solver for PDEs. There are some others, but they are also highly related to multigrid. They come under the class of multi-level methods. So there are algebraic multi-level methods that don't really depend on meshes and grids. So that is one thing. Does the Lax-Milgram on stability can be applied to finite volume? Technically, yes, because the finite volume method is actually a discontinuous finite element method where we only use piecewise constant polynomials. So technically, yes, Lax-Milgram can be applied to finite volume in that it can be applied to discontinuous Galerkin discretizations. But it's not the same form that is used for the continuous finite element methods, but an analogous form can be applied to discontinuous methods. Multigrid techniques, please give examples. So again, one example was the nonlinear multigrid method that we can use in CFD, which is a geometric multigrid method. What is the functional space that is used? Yes, that is a whole nice topic. So typically for compressible flow problems, the original problem is typically just in L2 space because we want to allow discontinuities. So we don't want to make it more specific than that. But if you want to solve something more specific like incompressible Navier-Stokes or some other problem like structural mechanics, then typically we use Sobolev spaces like H1 space or H-div space. So all of those spaces are used. And then once we discretize, then it's typically some polynomial space. And where the different methods differ are what are the basic functions we use to represent that polynomial space. Can we solve boundary value problems, including mixed conditions with these solvers? Yes, definitely, yes. Typically, I mean, most of the problems that I talked about were boundary value problems. I just didn't talk about the boundary conditions, but they are a very important part and typically a tricky part as well. So yes, they are very important, and yes, all these methods can be used for boundary value problems. Real life applications, again, airplanes, the rockets, as I mentioned, ships, blood flow, they are used in many, many different fields. How different is the meshing? That's actually a good question. So finite volume methods typically tend to be second order accurate in space. So we typically need more fine meshes for finite volume method to get to a certain accuracy. Finite element methods, even though typically they are second order accurate, they can be made arbitrarily accurate without too much more effort. So if you do have a highly accurate finite element method, we can use coarser meshes. But apart from that, the considerations are more similar than they are different, actually. But yes, the devil is in the details. So it really depends on the specific method that we are using. Can you suggest any good book? If I can share my slides, then in the slides, I do have a reference section where I have some references, so that could help. Is it possible to write code for the problem on your own? It is possible, and depending on your tastes, it can be very fun. But typically you don't, unless that is really what you want to do, you want to use a package. So there are many good packages for PDs in general. There are many good packages for CFD, and there are many open source packages that you can actually use as well as learn from. So I would encourage you to just Google search on open source finite element packages or open source fluid dynamics packages. You will get many of them, and many of them are very good. Learn fluid dynamics in an easy manner. Yes, there are many. Yeah, I'll have to, I guess, put it somewhere. How do we compare ON and ON log n, which is better? Oh, okay. So this is typical. I'm sorry if this was, if some people did not get this part. The ON and the ON log n, those are typically asymptotic estimates on the cost of a method. So n, if n is the number of cells, then if we say that an algorithm is ON, what that means is that the cost of the algorithm is linearly bounded by the problem size. So if I double the size of the problem, then asymptotically, I just need double the cost to compute the solution. And the cost is typically the number of arithmetic operations or the number of memory transactions that are needed. So ON log n is a little bit worse than ON, but I have reason to believe that in practice, it's difficult to tell them apart. So ON is about as good as ON log n in practice. But ON squared is not good, essentially. That's one of the main points. I'm not sure about infinite boundary conditions, but I'm sure those can be handled as well, but I don't know about that. Which is the most essential topic that a PG student should be thorough with to get into the research? I would say you need to know your undergraduate fluid dynamics as well as linear algebra very well and multivariable calculus very well. If you have these three things, I think that is a good preparation for research in fluid dynamics. So again, undergraduate fluid dynamics, which is essentially all of these Navier-Stokes equations and boundary layers and all that, multivariable calculus and linear algebra. These three things are essential. Can you suggest some open source names for programming codes? Yes, there are several. So you can look at Deal2, you can look at MFEM, which is MFEM. You can look at SU2. Even there is a professor at TIFR who I used to follow, Praveen. His name is Dr. Praveen. He has some codes based on Deal 2. There are many open source codes out there. Is the method only applied for stability limits? No, it's applied to solve the problems, but for stability limits, you actually need different methods to compute what are the stability limits. So I have not really talked about that. That's a good point. I have a problem with non-dimensionalization. Again, that is kind of off topic, but non-dimensionalization is very important. I already talked about the software. How do I choose the boundary values? That really depends on the physics. That really depends on the problem that I want to solve. Actually, that is a very difficult and very relevant question. How do we choose the boundary values? In general, this is difficult to do, but for the cases that I used, they are well-researched canonical cases. So I did not have this issue, but if I want to solve a real problem which is new, then yes, this is a good question, and I don't have an answer for that. Boundary values. So what you suggest is most appropriate for biomathematics. Okay, that's good. Yeah, you typically care then about incompressible Navier-Stokes, but most of the techniques that I mentioned apply equally. Topics for small projects and linear algebra for undergrad students. So you can try to say use Octave or MATLAB codes. You can try to write such codes, small codes for solving simple 1D and 2D, say Poisson equation or heat equation, and try to write your own, say, Gauss-Seidel solver or your own Gaussian elimination even, and try to code those up. And that could be a nice exercise. But again, I'm sure your professors can suggest you nice topics for these. Okay, I think, can this method be used asymptotically also? I'm not sure what that means. Can you explain how FEM is applied for incompressible fluid flow? What about the stability? Yes, FEM can be applied for incompressible fluid flow, but it's a pretty big topic, and it will not be possible to go through that right now. But yes, that is a good question. FEM for incompressible fluid flow is used by many groups and companies even. For example, if I know this correctly, I'm not totally sure, but I think, say, ComSol multiphysics, for example, uses a continuous finite element method for fluid flow. But its stability, yes, that is a good question. Typically, we need tricks, I would say, for ensuring that stability. So if we just apply the incompressible Navier-Stokes, if you apply a continuous finite element to incompressible Navier-Stokes, it might be unstable. Yes, you're right. We need methods for that. There are many papers on the topic, so I would encourage you to do a search online. What is the order of convergence for the solver being used? Yes. So for the solver that I was using, the results that I showed, that was a second order convergence. And that is the industry standard. So finite volume methods are typically second order accurate. But with finite element methods, it's easier to get more and more accurate techniques. Okay, I think, okay, do researchers take boundary conditions that are already there in the literature, or they change them as per the problem? So it depends. If your problem is similar enough to a different problem in literature, then it makes sense to just pick up the existing boundary conditions, because finding the new boundary conditions is a time-taking and relatively challenging thing. So, but yes, if you have a new problem, then you would need to find your own boundary conditions, and I honestly don't have experience with them. Because the kind of problems that I deal with are, say, aircraft design problems. So if you want to design an aircraft, then the boundary conditions for aircrafts are relatively well known. What is the difficult part is actually getting these things to converge for, say, complex geometries and complex flow features that happen close to the boundary, but in the domain. Yeah, so his name is C Praveen in DIFR.